Hello and welcome to the Get the Trolls Out podcast series. In each episode, we invite inspiring individuals to share their work in combating discrimination and hate. Join us as we explore the initiatives that address religious hate speech and media biases and learn how you can get involved in creating a more inclusive world. Get the Trolls Out aims to counter discrimination and intolerance on religious grounds across the European media landscape. Led by MTI and in collaboration with 6 partner organizations, we harness the power of social media to promote dialogues and counter narratives of hate.
In line with Refugee Week, we have invited here with us today Tom Green, who is a senior producer at Counterpoints Arts, an organization that works to support and produce work by, about, and with refugees and migrants. Counterpoints coordinates the annual Refugee Week Festival, as well as a range of programs and commissions across the UK and internationally.
Thank you, Tom, for joining us today. And before we dive into some questions, could I ask you to please tell us a little more about your work at Counterpoints Arts and how this initiative provides a platform for migrants and refugees?
Hi, thanks for having me. Great to be here. So I'm a producer, which kind of covers pretty much everything, but at the heart of my work and our work as an organization is working with artists and organizations to help them make the work that they want to make. And so that can be connecting them to people, helping people develop projects, thinking through different aspects of their practice. We've been going for 12 years. And our roots are in Refugee Week, and as you mentioned, that's a program that we still coordinate. So that is an example of part of our work that's really public-facing, about reaching as many people across the widest demographic, really, as possible. Other aspects of our work are more focused, as I say, on supporting artists, on working with organizations, but we cover that whole spectrum. We're an arts organization, but are also have a foot very firmly in the refugee and migration sectors, as well as working across media and popular culture, and we're partners in many different sectors as well.
Thank you so much. So I'll dive straight into the question. And the first question is, what level or levels of discrimination, particularly in relation to diversity categories such as religion, do migrants and refugees face in your region, and how do you and your work help to counter them?
So I think if we talk about work here in the UK, then I don't know that it's that dissimilar from other parts of Europe, but obviously it is specific. And I would say, because you're mentioning religion, I think as a generalization, the UK is not a country where religion is prominent, particularly in public discourse. Of course, it's there for many people in all aspects of society, but it tends, and I would say generally, historically, is not, or in the last sort of 40 years, is not the main lens for discrimination. Of course, it is present, and of course there's an intersection, but I would say it's more been about race generally, and then migration and difference generally. The connections between all these things are obviously complicated, and many people would be able to tell their personal stories of how that works. I think the bigger picture in the UK context in this question around migration and refugees is that there's been a systematic attempt, and in fact, possibly this country was one of the first to pioneer these systematic attempts, known from the start as the hostile environment to migration. And this was based on sort of a pest control theory of creating hostile environments, to get rid of rats. This is the kind of level of discourse that was introduced back in 2012. And it's easy to imagine this was just people casting around for kind of an idea, but how can we kind of bring some new language and new kind of get people animated about this subject? But its effects have obviously been very long lasting and pernicious. it actually sort of institutionalized the idea of, let's say migration policy in a kind of the most neutral term is enacted by society as a whole. But obviously this is framed in very strongly anti-migrant and anti-refugee and asylum seeker rhetoric and thinking, with very overt signage and vans blaring out, you need to go home and all this kind of stuff. So that, and it's still talked about, it's not really talked about so much by politicians now, but it's still very prevalent in the experiences that people have. And of course, across the whole spectrum of migration, refugees and asylum seekers, very many different experiences. But I think at the core of it, you see it coming up in many different ways, people's lives being made difficult in numerous ways, from the sort of small to the really significant, a constant underfunding, under-resource, terrible administration and bureaucracy that feels deliberate, and then specific policies that kind of either directly attack or eat away at people's rights, people's sense of belonging, people's citizenship, their capacity to do things. So that has moved beyond any focus on any kind of particular group in terms of ethnicity or religion. It's been really addressing, in a way, imagined idea of foreignness and migration, which maybe we'll talk about how these imagined ideas get shaped, because I think that it's almost on the rhetorical level, it's living as a kind of almost a conceptual thing that isn't really connected to any, because you're lumping in people who've lived here their whole lives with people who've just arrived yesterday, and attacking them and attempting to put them in the same picture. Obviously, none of those should be in a negative picture, but they shouldn't be in the same picture anyway. There's people with very different needs and experiences, sort of through rhetoric, and with racism being obviously then a very strong element of that. That this feels like I'm saying a very long sentence when I'm getting to the end, but it's also then in this country played out through the Brexit conversation, which obviously reached its climax a few years ago, but is still, the ripples of that are still there. So that's another, I think, quite peculiar to this country, although other countries will have their own version of it. In this country, it's also then linked to a history as a colonizer, a nostalgia for those times. So there are a lot of different cross currents. And in terms of how our work exists then to try and address that, well, we're an arts organisation, so we believe that arts has the power to create social change. Most of our work is not about directly addressing any of these issues individually or thinking about policies. And maybe in a way that's why for us it's helpful to think about this bigger picture, because arts and culture is addressing that bigger picture. Who are we living here together? What does it mean to be different? For individual people, what is my difference? What is my belonging? How do I relate to other people? These are the kind of questions that artists are always wanting to ask and explore. We're looking, obviously, particularly in this context of new arrivals, of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants. But the point for us is that can be explored, and change can happen through music, through a concert, through diversity operating in many different ways. It doesn't have to be always addressing something head on, because the culture is much more complicated and multiplicitous, if that's a word, than that. So that's where arts and culture has the possibility to create new kinds of conversations, to create change in ways that sometimes might be immediate, but sometimes might come over a long period of time. So that's really the focus of our work, as well as at a more practical level, just helping people from refugee and migrant backgrounds to get access to opportunities, to opportunities for funding, for performance, to develop their career, and also for access to audiences, as well as audiences from those backgrounds and communities from those backgrounds having the rights and the opportunities to access creativity and support for their own cultural development.
Thank you. I think you touched upon a whole lot of important subjects. And I think another thing that we also see a lot is this speaking for rather than speaking with. I think your work is definitely, it's about involving community, providing a positive voice. And what we see a lot, at least as well, is often whenever migrants, refugees, asylum seekers are brought into topics of conversation, it's always in a negative light or some kind of division. And obviously a huge role in that is the role of the media. So I was going to ask also how you have seen the media coverage, especially in the UK, how it has impacted migrants and refugee representation.
Yeah, and it's a really big question, and although probably with quite a simple answer, which is really, really badly. And you can do a Google image search on refugees. There's not a lot of range there. It's people on boats in life jackets. And he sounds like, well, wow, have we moved on in 30 years from when, or however long it is when people started thinking about these questions of representation? And sometimes as from time ago, sometimes the NGOs aren't helping that. Sometimes those images of victims of suffering are the ones that are most effective at winning support and winning fundraising. It's always obviously very hard to make the kind of causal links between images and opinions and change, but there obviously has been in this country, it's not so much now. It did get quite tied up with different political causes, but of the demonizing, particularly of refugees and asylum seekers for a long time. I guess over the years, there's always a different target. And so one common theme has been young black men has always been so whenever that can get fixed in, that's the image that will be the most powerful to use negatively. So threat in that sense, or victim in the other sense. Quite a lot of shots of sort of helpless children, of suffering women are also used, and probably most people would think of those as in a way a positive or an empathetic kind of portrayal, but obviously it's incredibly reductive. People will speak for themselves about how that makes them feel, but I don't think it's hard to understand what the impact of that has, even when people are kind of sympathetic. But the levels that this operates at, I think still people are even just starting to understand. There was a story this week, which is tangential, but I think very sort of related, of the England football team had a sort of fairly irrelevant defeat to a smaller footballing nation. But it was a kind of humiliation. The image that a lot of the press chose was of one of the young black players who didn't even play for very much of the match. So the campaigners actually highlighted, said, why are you choosing this image of this player who was by no means central? He only played for 20 minutes. But so many of the media chose that image of him looking kind of forlorn. Now that wasn't it wasn't like a horrible picture, but that was a choice that had been made at a certain level. And this goes back, thinking of football is a little bit of a window into the national psyche. Those black players are the ones who are demonized the previous kind of defeat, both with some very overt and aggressive online hate. So I think for people who, like myself, who are not experiencing that directly themselves, we as a society can observe in those moments how clearly deep-rooted and kind of pernicious these portrayals can be. What we know in a positive way is that Refugee Week, and we alluded to it earlier, is a time when there are an awful lot of positive and self-represented images. And that's really is at the heart of all our work about arts and culture, because that is about representation. You don't necessarily talk about positive always arts and culture, because that's more sort of instrumentalizing. But in Refugee Week we do. That's a very deliberate. So Refugee Week is framed around being positive, telling positive stories, celebrating people's creativity and resilience and contributions and whatever they want to bring. And we know that that's the most positive time in the media for these stories. And one of the things also that we talk about is that it's very hard the rest of the year not to be reactive. Certainly this is not so much the arts sector. The arts sector can do a lot, but in the kind of refugee and migration sector, there's always something. There's always a politician said something. There's been a tragedy. There's been a controversy. What do you think? And however much you try and bring a wider context and a frame, you're being framed by the news agenda, which is inevitably, and it's not just to do with this subject, everything is to do with conflict. And of course, the social media discourse. Well, Refugee Week, we set the agenda together as a collective, and we become good collectively at setting that agenda. So we set a theme. So that's what we're going to frame it with. So the theme for this year's Refugee Week is our home. So we're going to talk about home. What does that mean? All those ways. And you see it play out across not just the national media, but actually really significantly the local media. And I think probably the local media's got a bit better over the years at not just covering these stories negatively, because I think communities are so much more diverse. The staff of these media are much more diverse, but still there aren't so many stories, but you feel they really are hungry actually for these positive and different stories. And when they come, they really give them a lot of airtime and a lot of proper journalistic kind of platform and presentation. So it really shows what is possible. And I think that there is a lot of appetite and a lot of people who really enjoy reading these stories and are really on board with it. We're still getting too much dominated by the negative agenda of conflict, and it's very, very hard to break out of. But we do know, and the other thing that's important for us with Refugee Week is it is about movement building as well. It's not a PR campaign and it's not even just an arts program and festival. It is about movement building, even though we don't always use that language, because it's a bit more maybe of a kind of American kind of thinking. But I don't know. Sorry, we had a bit of background noise. Oh, okay, it's fine. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, I've garbled that bit, but yeah.
Actually, this sits nicely with what our next question for you was. We wanted to know a little bit about the ongoing projects that you have and something that the public in the UK can actually be involved in maybe, and you can possibly just tell us a little bit about what's coming up next after Refugee Week, because I know this is a sustained sort of, I won't use the word movement, but an endeavor. So if you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, so we have a whole range of programs. As I say, the biggest one every June around World Refugee Day on the 20th of June is Refugee Week, and people can find information about that online really easily, and there's stuff happening everywhere. All round the year, there is also actually arts and cultural activities run by us, but also run by people everywhere. It's one of the real privileges of our work is to get to see and connect and work with people all around the country. So I think for anyone who's interested in this kind of work, arts and culture in this context, I feel confident in saying there'll always be something, often loads of things locally to where they are. And in a very rare chance there aren't, then they can definitely start something. And I think in the UK arts and culture scene and the whole not-for-profit sector is very community-driven. You don't often see that again, particularly in the press and media, but it's really there in every community. There are things that are going on. There are people who are making things happen in all sorts of brilliant ways. We work with particular partners. It's important for us that, as well as the community spaces, that the big venues are also programming this kind of work, and artists are reaching wide audiences. So we work with the South Bank Centre. We have some work with them in London happening later in the year. We're working with the Victorian Album Museum, a number of cinemas, including the BFI, BAFTA. And again, quite a few of those will have relevant programming around the year as well. Obviously, for us, a good way to know about that is to sign up to our newsletter. But I would really encourage people, wherever they're living, to find that we know lots of people doing this work all year round. And I think generally cultural institutions and programmers have become much, much more diverse. Partly, I think, driven by audience demand. I think one of the great things about the UK is that I think it is definitely true to say that younger people are very much, very, very strongly pro diversity of thought and of arts and culture. And I remember a few years ago someone telling me that where they were living, that there was a kind of folk scene, which said was nice, but actually the younger people were just crying out for more diversity in the arts because, they're living online as well. They can access stuff more around the world. They want to see it as well. They don't actually want things to be reduced. Quite the opposite. They want things to be interconnected, kind of mixed up and fresh and exciting. So I think actually the cultural scene, in spite of a lot of pressures, is really exciting, very diverse. Lots of also really interesting conversations that are going on around this subject. One of the possibly most important has been with the National Trust, which is the organisation, sort of the big heritage organisation, which a few years ago started investigating the history of the buildings that it owned. Not particularly, it's not really its own responsibility. It's come into ownership of these buildings as a kind of safeguarding, but they're thought of in this country as these sort of neutral places of splendour that kind of always been there. And of course you scratch a tiny bit beneath the surface and where did all this money come from? An awful lot of it, vast majority of it, came from being an empire. An awful lot of the wealth of the empire came from slavery and slavery related trade. Now that caused a bit of kickback of people saying, why do you hate Britain? Saying, well, we don't hate Britain. We're just trying to do some proper history. And that goes on. But actually, of course, it creates a much more interesting conversation for everyone to actually try and understand what actually happened, why the landscape looks the way it does, where things actually come from. That, of course, is also being presented to a lot of museums as well about where things come from. A lot of that is quite an ugly, violent story. But as the institutions get the courage and the confidence to actually address it, there is the potential actually to have much more interesting, equal conversations that can also connect this country, can help build these the positive side of having had an empire is that there are a lot of connections. For all the trauma that's been involved, the UK has a lot of connections with people around the world. And actually, if there's a bit of restorative justice, then the potential for building those connections positively is really huge. So a lot of that on the ground, away from angry people online, I think is going on. There's obviously, it takes time and there's a lot of difficulty, but we definitely see a lot of progress on that. And actually, I remember hearing someone quite prominent in these debates saying, for all the sort of fury about this sort of restitution, the argument's lost. The younger people aren't interested in going back to this colonial mindset. They're totally, the argument's been won. It will take time to play out. But so let's hope that's true. That's a kind of hopeful and a hopeful sign. And of course, there's a lot of negative things to look at as well, but I think there is a lot of truth in that.
So that's really good to know all of these positive things, because you're right, in some of this work, you end up hearing just the negatives, and it can be sort of stifling. I was wondering if you have, just to keep in line with the work that you're doing and the people that you meet through the work you do, if you've had some time to listen and maybe some reflections on what the policymakers in this country can do better. Something simple. It doesn't have to be something that the government will take years to do. If you have some ideas on it, we'd love to know.
It's a really good question, and it's not really something that is our primary focus, but of course we're working in this context, so we are aware of a lot of these things. I do feel that the tone that people take is actually really important. It's obviously a bit more than tone, but in a way it is about tone. And so some of the policies that the present, or can we call them previous government, has taken, like the Rwanda plan, was not. It was possibly less of a serious proposal than about creating a mess. And what we know is it caused an awful lot of serious anxiety for a lot of people in the asylum system. So there's a lot of things that governments over the years have done, that, so this is going back to the hostile environment, that they've done to kind of create anxiety. So changing that language, whichever government is the next government. I'm not quite sure whether we do currently. I suppose we do still have a government while there's an election going on. But anyway, there is still a government, but whoever is the next government, changing that language. And then I do also know that very specifically, it's maybe not an easy thing to sort, but it is. Well, maybe I'll say a couple of things. One is about the right to work while people are claiming asylum, because for a long time people have said this is just crazy. You're keeping people waiting years and years and years. And not only is that economically damaging, it's like psychologically brutalizing to people to not allow them to work. And then the other thing that I know is very prevalent for people is about housing. It's because especially recently they were trying to reduce the asylum backlog, so quite a lot of decisions being made, and people have so little time to go from, at least however bad this is the whole issue about how bad the housing is for asylum seekers. So that's one issue which could be addressed. A lot of people are making a huge amount of money out of this system because it's privately contracted out, and what people are getting is awful. Really, really awful. But then when they get a decision, they're then getting no time at all to find housing, and it's totally inhumane and counterproductive. You're just leaving people totally adrift. And so we know arts organisations who are working with people in those positions end up helping people navigate those systems, which really they shouldn't need to do, but they do need to do. And some of them have become good at it and have made it part of their work, which, maybe as long as they can plan that is okay. They can kind of help refer people, because one of the things that artists and arts organisations are good at is building up trust and confidence. And that's something that's very hard for people new in the country to build up with people. So when they do build it up, they're inevitably going to share what they need. And so I think really any organisation working in this field has to learn not to necessarily be experts, but to know enough about how to refer people on. So I think, housing, the right to work, and just a change of the tone. Asylum seekers are not the main challenge this country is facing. It's really very doable, actually positive economically, culturally, and socially. And just bear in mind, we're helping people who are escaping awful, awful situations. We should feel good about that as a country. And I know that this argument politically has moved a very long way from that positive framing, but a lot of people away from the politics feel it, do understand this. A lot of people in this country have recent family experiences of this or something similar. They know what it is, and if we can, and I think this is why your campaign around how this is played out online is so important, because it is still a very powerful sort of thought leader about how these conversations are framed, and it's hard to have the more nuanced, sympathetic, thoughtful conversations online. And I'm sure it is possible, but also people need to understand, recognize what is just not worth pursuing, what is trolling, and obviously, yeah, although that's all your area of expertise, but it really is so important. And we see it I think we don't feel it so much as a national organisation, but a lot of the local organisations and just individual people, this is a very hostile space for them. People get targeted, all sorts. So it's really important that that's addressed.
Well, you're absolutely right about nuance being lost in today's representation of migrants, and I think that's something we are hoping to change in a small way through our campaign this week. I want to thank you, Tom, for joining us today. It was really good to hear your insights into this world, and I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of comprehensive inputs on this topic. I would like to encourage all our listeners to check out the impactful and important work that Counterpoints and Tom and his friends are doing, especially during this Refugee Week. And thank you. Thank you for listening.